boy weighed nothing. That was Pomfrey's first thought when they brought him in. Not the scar, not the name, not the singular significance of looking at the only living person to have survived a killing curse. Her first thought was simply that he weighed nothing, and the thought stayed with her like a splinter as she settled him into the bed nearest the window and began the intake examination. She had managed worse presentations. She had seen cursed bites, and fiend-fire burns and a hex-misfired concussion that had required her to spend the better part of a night reconstructing a student's short-term memory in careful, painstaking sequence. What she had not managed was this: an 11-year-old boy deposited in her hospital wing unconscious, with no visible wounds she could account for, carried from the third-floor corridor by the headmaster himself, who had told her only that Harry had encountered something in the dungeons and that she should do her best. She had been Hogwarts matron for more than 2 decades. She had learned to read what Albus Dumbledore chose not to say. She did her best. The standard intake diagnostics first: pulse, core temperature, magical residue, respiratory function, all satisfactory. Her instruments told her the unconsciousness was recovery-induced. The body had chosen sleep because something had demanded everything it had, and now it was reclaiming the debt. She noted this. She wrote it down. She moved on. It was when she reached the full physical examination that the weight of her professional composure became something heavier. She worked through it the way she always worked through it, systematic and thorough, beginning at the crown and moving downward. She was methodical. She had always been methodical. The scar she already knew about. Everyone in the wizarding world knew about it, but she documented it anyway, noting the age of the tissue, the old white edges of an injury administered when the boy was very small. A healer's record was only as useful as it was complete. His face was thin. Not the thinness of illness, but something older, architectural thinness, the kind that had calcified over years into the precise way his cheekbones sat too close to the surface, the way the shape of his skull showed beneath the skin where it shouldn't. His wrists were thin. He was a child who looked even smaller than he was, because there was less of him than there should be. His glasses had been repaired with Scotch tape. She set them aside on the bedside table. The tape had gone yellow and was peeling at the corners, and there was enough of it that she counted at least 3 separate repairs at the bridge alone, which told her the cause had not been a single incident, but a recurring one. She noted this and moved on. His nose had been broken at least once. The repair was entirely natural. No episky, no scalar grow, no trained intervention of any kind. Just the body's own attempt to reassemble itself over time without assistance, the bridge sitting slightly off-center in a way that a competent repair would have corrected in 30 seconds. She had seen this kind of healing before, in cases she would have preferred not to encounter. She wrote it down without comment. His hands had calluses from sustained physical labor. She looked at them for a moment longer than the documentation required. He was 11 years old. 1 rib had healed off angle. Not recently, and not severely. The bone had set without correction, slightly askew from where it should have been. A small, imperfect repair that spoke clearly to anyone looking for what had not been looked after. The calcification told her it had occurred some years ago and had simply never been attended to. She put her quill down. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the hospital wing. The boy breathed steadily behind her. Through the tall windows, the sky over the loch was the deep dark of a Scottish June, the kind that wouldn't reach full black at this latitude, not at this time of year. She had known, in an abstract sense, that Harry Potter went home to Muggles each summer. She had known the name Dursley from his school records, and had filed it away with everything else she hadn't been asked about. She had treated his Quidditch bruises and his potion burns, and had not thought about where he went in June. She was thinking about it now. She picked up her quill. She finished the record, working through the remaining fields with the same methodical care she had applied to everything before it. When she had finished, she read it through twice, once quickly and once slowly. And then she looked at the length of it, the density of it, the sheer number of things there were to write down about one 11-year-old boy. 3 weeks. He would be discharged in 3 weeks, and he would go back to where his rib had healed without correction and his nose had set without anyone straightening it. She pulled a fresh sheet of parchment from the second drawer. She did not pause. She had considered that she might, the way one thinks about the difficulty of a thing before beginning it. But when it came to the moment was quite clear. She was a healer. He was her patient. He was 11 years old, and he was going back to a house where his rib had healed off angle because no one had taken him to someone like her. The pause, when she examined the available space it might have occupied, was not there. She wrote the second copy. She wrote it in the same careful hand, the same clinical language, the same systematic progression from acute findings to chronic indicators. She addressed it to the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, Ministry of Magic, London, and sealed it with the hospital wing's official stamp, the institutional one, the one that announced itself as documentation rather than merely correspondence. One of the school's administrative owls took it from her hands and was through the open window. Before she had finished deciding, she had no hesitation about this. She watched it go, the pale shape of it dissolving into the dark over the lock, and turned back to the room. She returned to her patient's bedside. She straightened the blanket across his thin shoulders, adjusted the position of his pillow. He breathed deeply and slowly, giving nothing to anything but the necessary repair of itself. She sat down at her desk. She opened the iron-hinged patient file drawer, charmed against unauthorized access, as all such drawers were, and filed the original record inside, noting the date and time in the margin. Late May. Close to midnight. She closed the drawer and turned the lock, and set her hands flat on the desk in front of her. The castle settled into quiet. The portraits along the corridor had stopped pretending to be awake. She was not, generally speaking, given to reflection as a professional habit. Reflection had its uses, but had a tendency, in her experience, to talk one out of things that simply needed doing. She had done what was required. The record was filed. The copy was sent. She did not undo decisions she had made correctly. She knew Dumbledore would come. She had known it since the moment she addressed the second parchment. He would come in the morning, or before morning if his portraits had been awake, and he would have things to say that were in all likelihood very important and quite possibly entirely correct. She did not doubt that Dumbledore was in possession of reasons. She did not doubt this. She also did not find that it changed anything. She was the matron of Hogwarts School. Her concern was the welfare of the children in her care. This child was in her care. She had done what that required, and she was prepared to say so plainly to anyone who asked. She had the rest of the night to settle on the precise form of the saying, and she intended to use it. She folded her hands on the desk. She waited. He came at first light. That was not unusual for Dumbledore. First light found him awake on most mornings, and a student gravely injured in the school's dungeons was always reason enough. Pomfrey had heard him coming from halfway down the corridor, the familiar unhurried footfall, the slight pause at the door before entering. She had sat at her desk with her hands folded, and she had waited. She had not slept. He looked at Harry first. That was not unusual either. Dumbledore had always been solicitous about his students, whatever else might be true of him, and he looked at the unconscious boy in the bed nearest the window with an expression that was entirely readable and entirely genuine. Which was the thing about Albus Dumbledore that made him so formidable to disagree with. His care for Harry Potter was real. The blue eyes behind the half-moon spectacles, the silver hair loose at this hour, the crooked nose that had been broken in another century and set imperfectly, the particular way the very old carry themselves, as though they have stopped needing to hurry. All of it said, "I am here for the child." And that was true. It was simply not all that was true. "How is he?" Dumbledore asked. "Recovering," she said. "The unconsciousness is fatigue. His body is reclaiming what it spent. He'll wake in a day or two at most. There is no ongoing danger." He nodded, still watching Harry, and she could see him composing the conversation before it happened. He had a way of doing that, arriving already, knowing the shape of what he intended to say, pausing only to confirm that the room matched his preparations. This morning the room did not match. "I have filed a formal medical report on Harry Potter," she said, documenting findings consistent with chronic malnourishment and sustained neglect, beginning with evidence apparent at this admission. The original is in the hospital wing patient files. I have sent a copy to the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. The pause that followed was precisely calibrated. Not the pause of a man who had not understood, but the pause of a man who had understood very quickly and was taking the measure of how to respond. "Poppy," he said. "The owl left before midnight. I sent it last night before you arrived." He turned from the bed. He looked at her directly, and behind the spectacles, his eyes were still the particular shade of blue that people invariably called kind, which she had always found accurate but incomplete. Kind was a quality. The quality was genuinely present. Behind it was something considerably older and considerably more accustomed to the work of weighing one necessity against another. "I would ask you to consider," he said quietly, "what you may have set in motion." "I have considered it. The arrangement that placed Harry with his aunt and uncle is not a matter of preference. It is a magical protection activated by his mother's sacrifice and anchored to the blood of a living relative. As long as Harry calls that house his home, Voldemort cannot touch him there. It is the only protection of its kind available to him. The Dark Lord's body may be destroyed, but his spirit is not. That is not a permanent state of affairs." "I understand what you've told me." "Then you understand what disrupting that arrangement would mean for this child." "I understand your argument," she said. "I'm not disputing the magic. I'm telling you what I found on my examination table." He looked at her steadily. She looked back. She was not, she reflected, a person who found the sustained attention of Albus Dumbledore easy to return. She had met him many times over the years, and each time there was the sense of being assessed with instruments more precise than anything she kept in her own cabinet. But she had filed the report. That fact existed in the world now, fixed and irretrievable, and it made the looking back considerably simpler. "You're in a difficult position," he said. "I am in a very clear position," she said. "You are in a difficult one." He did not answer immediately. He turned back toward the bed, toward Harry, still and small against the white pillow, the two visible hollows of his face catching the morning light from the windows. He looked at the boy for what felt like a long time. Then he said quietly, "The copy cannot be recalled." "No," she said. "It cannot." He did not argue further. He did not raise his voice, and he did not threaten, and she gave him some credit for both. He stood at the foot of the bed, looking at Harry, and then he straightened slightly, not stiffening, but settling into whatever composure a man of more than 110 years adopted when he recognized that a situation had moved beyond his reach. And he turned and walked to the door. He stopped there, his hand on the frame. "I will need to speak with Amelia," he said. Not to her, particularly. More in the manner of a man taking stock. "Yes," she said. "I imagine you will." He left. His footsteps receded down the corridor, as unhurried as ever. She sat alone with her patient, and the morning light moved across the floor, and she thought, not for the first time, that the hospital wing was an unusually honest room. People came to it, stripped of most of what they used to be, something other than what they were, and the things that mattered in other rooms of the castle mattered considerably less here. She had kept this room for more than 2 decades. It had not always been easy. It had never, on reflection, been unclear. She went to put the kettle on. The morning post at the Department of Magical Law Enforcement arrived in 3 waves. Amelia Bones sorted through all 3 the same way she sorted through everything, by priority marker, working from the overnight correspondence first. The Hogwarts Hospital Wing's administrative seal was not one she had encountered before. She recognized it as institutional rather than personal, the kind of formal seal that announced itself as documentation. She opened it before anything else on the desk. She had a square jaw and wore a monocle, and behind the monocle she read with the same systematic attention she brought to all case material. She read the 3 pages through once quickly. She read them again slowly, taking her time with the clinical language. Clinical language, in her experience, did not permit misreading, and she intended not to misread it. When she had finished the second reading, she set the pages flat on the desk and looked at the window for a moment. Her brother Edgar had been killed in 1981, along with his wife and his children. The Death Eaters who killed them had not been subtle about it. She had read the official reports in the weeks after, all of them, every page, and what they documented was the particular outcome of people who had been left unprotected because the institutions that should have protected them had been overwhelmed or occupied elsewhere, or had made a quiet calculation that the resources required were not proportionate to the threat. The Bones family had not been famous enough to matter until they were dead, at which point their deaths had become a line in official reports that Amelia had read and filed and continued working after. She did not, as a professional matter, make personal comparisons when reviewing case material. It was a discipline she had cultivated deliberately and maintained carefully for 12 years. She picked up a quill. She was fair. She had always been told she was fair, and she had always understood fairness to mean something precise and somewhat uncomfortable. That she could not act on one document from one source about a child she had not spoken with, regardless of what the document described. That the report source was a Hogwarts matron with an institutional seal and the professional vocabulary of a trained healer did not change this. That the patterns documented were consistent and detailed and used the language of sustained deprivation rather than incidental injury did not change this either. She needed to speak with the child before the child left for the summer. She needed to speak with the child before Dumbledore had the opportunity to explain what the child ought to say. She wrote a letter to the headmaster of Hogwarts, formal and precisely worded, invoking her authority under DMLE welfare inquiry procedures to request an interview with Harry Potter prior to the end of term. She noted that the interview was requested in her official capacity, that the request was non-discretionary under the relevant welfare protocols, and that she expected a response within 3 working days. She sealed it with the DMLE seal. She called for a ministry owl. She went back to her correspondence. Outside her window, 7 levels down, the ministry's atrium hummed steadily in the green light, the way it always did, the way it had for years, the machinery of things continuing as though the morning had been entirely ordinary. She did not think it would remain that way. He woke to light. That was the first thing. Light, and the smell of something herbal, and the particular quiet of a room that wasn't quite empty but was close to it. He lay still for a moment, taking inventory of himself, checking whether everything worked the way it was supposed to. It did, more or less, though more or less included a bone-deep tiredness he had never felt before, and the vague sense that something enormous had happened while he was somewhere else. Then he remembered that something enormous had happened, and he was not somewhere else. He was in the hospital wing, and Quirrell was gone, and Voldemort had been there, and then not there, and it was over. He lay still for another minute, just being glad to be on the other side of it. "You're awake," said Madame Pomfrey, materializing from wherever she'd been, and the word carried a particular professional satisfaction. She had clearly been counting days and was pleased to arrive at this one. "Stay still. I need to check your readings." Harry stayed still. She was efficient about it, as she was efficient about everything, and she told him he had been unconscious for 3 days, that his pulse was satisfactory, that he was not to try sitting up quickly for at least another hour. He said he understood. She said she would know if he did otherwise. He believed her. It was Ron who came first, thundering through the hospital wing doors with the energy of someone who had been told to be quiet so many times that restraint had become a physical effort. He pulled up short at the foot of the bed, looked at Harry and said, "Blimey, you look terrible." "Hello to you too," Harry said. "I mean, you're fine? You're actually fine?" Ron's freckles stood out more than usual, the way they did when something had frightened him. "Because we didn't know, for a bit. Hermione kept saying you'd be all right, but she had that face she makes when she's not sure." "I don't have a face," said Hermione from directly behind him, which made Ron jump sideways. She had a bruise on her arm, and an expression suggesting she had opinions about the entire sequence of events, starting from approximately the moment Neville had tried to stop them leaving the common room, and that she intended to share every one of them. She sat down on the chair beside the bed and looked at Harry in the manner of someone checking that a door was properly shut. "You have been unconscious for 3 days, she said. Madame Pomfrey told me it was the longest she had kept a first year under observation." "She told you that," Harry said. "I asked. I was worried." "I know," he said, and he did. And that was its own kind of strange good thing, that she had been worried, that they were both here. He told them what had happened in the dungeons. Not all at once. It came in stops and starts, the way memories do when some parts are sharp and others have blurred over. Quirrell and the mirror, and what had been at the back of Quirrell's head. He watched Hermione's expression move through at least 4 separate reactions to the back of the head detail. Ron kept making a face that suggested he was reconsidering several things simultaneously. "Voldemort," Ron said, carefully, in the way he said it when he was trying to say it normally and not quite managing. "He was actually there. Part of him," Harry said. "I think. Dumbledore explained it. Sort of. And the stone," Hermione said. "What happened to the stone?" "Destroyed. Dumbledore sorted it." He paused. "Nicholas Flamel is going to die." Hermione pressed her lips together. She did not say anything for a moment, which was unusual enough that it felt like its own kind of answer, that she had opinions about this too, and was deciding whether expressing them was appropriate given the circumstances. "All right," she said finally. "All right." The afternoon went that way, in the 3 of them, and the familiar banter that had established itself over a year of shared meals and panics and moving staircases. Ron beat him at chess, which was probably the most normal thing to have happened to Harry in a week. Hermione read to them from a book she had brought on the apparent theory that hospitalization was no excuse for letting standards slip. Harry didn't mind. The ordinary was remarkably pleasant after everything. Dumbledore came in the late afternoon. He entered the way he entered most rooms, unhurried, with the ease of someone who had been in a great many rooms and found them all more or less manageable. And he sat beside Harry's bed and spoke about the things that had happened in a way that made them feel survivable in retrospect. Quirrell was gone. The stone was destroyed, and Nicholas Flamel was at peace with this. Voldemort had fled and was no more immediately dangerous than he had been before. The crooked nose and the half-moon spectacles and the silver hair that caught the afternoon light gave the whole conversation the quality of something being carefully and competently managed by someone who had been doing it for a very long time. He spoke of Lily, briefly, gently, the protection her sacrifice had created, the way it lived in Harry's skin, the reason Quirrell had not been able to touch him. Harry thought about his mother, who he didn't remember, who existed for him as a green flash and the sensation of being held. The thought was neither sharp enough to hurt properly, nor soft enough to sit easily. He had been carrying it for as long as he could remember, which was not, in the end, very long. And then Dumbledore said, easily, in the tone of a settled thing, "You'll be heading home soon. Back to your aunt and uncle, once Madame Pomfrey clears you." "Right," Harry said. "The summer will do you good, I expect." A small, warm smile. Some rest. Some time away from all of this. Harry nodded. He did not notice anything particular in Dumbledore's expression after. Why would he have? He was tired, and the afternoon was long, and there was nothing to notice in his own agreement, because it was simply true. He was going home. That was what happened when Hogwarts ended. Pomfrey's desk caught his eye as Dumbledore was saying goodbye. There was a stack of parchment on it she had covered with a folder when he'd glanced over earlier. He noticed it again now, the folder sitting at a slight angle, the corner of something official-looking just visible underneath. She was not someone who left things at angles. He filed it away the way he filed most adult behavior he couldn't account for, as something that wasn't his business. Ron came back after Dumbledore left, still annoyed about the chess queen he'd misplaced somewhere in the wing, and the sun moved steadily across the floor, and Pomfrey came round to tell them visiting hours were over, in the tone that meant she was not going to say it again. They went. The doors swung shut behind them. Harry lay in the quiet. He thought about summer. He would mow the lawn and weed the garden. He would cook breakfast and do it correctly. He would sleep in the second bedroom, Dudley's old one, still smelling of football boots, still better than the cupboard had been. He had a bedroom now. He would come back to all of this in September, the staircases and the owl post and the smell of the great hall, and it was enough to know that. He thought about it without dread, because dread required a framework he didn't have, a baseline of comparison he had never been offered. He pulled the blanket up around his shoulders. Someone had been watching over him for 3 days. He didn't know why that thought came to him just then. He hadn't thought about it particularly while it was happening, because you didn't, when you were unconscious. But it came now, in the quiet, with the sound of Pomfrey moving in the office at the far end of the ward, her footsteps brisk and certain as ever. He closed his eyes. He slept. She had sent the letter 3 weeks ago. There had been no reply, only a note, received 12 days after the original, from the headmaster's office, impeccably worded, thoroughly non-committal, expressing his interest in cooperating with the DMLE's welfare mandate in due course and at the appropriate time. She had read it twice, filed it, and that afternoon began drafting her travel request. She would go in person. That was what in person was for. The Hogwarts gates were iron and old, and designed to communicate something about permanence before anyone had even crossed the threshold. Amelia Bones passed through them without difficulty. She carried her DMLE warrant card and the full official weight of the department's welfare inquiry powers, and Gates could not be expected to resist that. She had sent 1 hour's advance notice by Ministry Owl, courteous and non-negotiable. He was at the entrance when she arrived. Albus Dumbledore in person was exactly what the reputation suggested, and more of some of it. The silver hair, the half-moon spectacles, the crooked nose, the particular way of someone who had been in rooms longer than most people had been alive. He was also headmaster, chief warlock, and supreme mugwump, and if she had not already spent 3 weeks reading his 12-day delayed non-answer, she might have paused to acknowledge how extraordinary a figure he was. "Madam Bones," he said, with warmth that was entirely genuine. "Headmaster." She shook his hand once. "I'm here to conduct a welfare interview with Harry Potter under DMLE welfare inquiry powers. Madam Pomfrey has agreed to be present. We can speak afterward." He looked at her over the spectacles. "I had hoped to speak first." "Afterward will suit us both," she said. What followed in the entrance hall was quiet and precise. The confrontation of 2 experienced institutional figures who had been in difficult rooms before and knew that making a scene in one accomplished nothing that a direct statement could not accomplish more cleanly. He made his argument. The blood protection magic rooted in Lily Potter's sacrifice, the necessity of Harry's continued residence with his blood relative, the catastrophic implication of disrupting the only active magical protection standing between an 11-year-old boy and a Dark Lord whose body was destroyed, but whose spirit persisted. He made it without heat and without theatre, as a man who was used to having his arguments received seriously and expected this one to be no different. She acknowledged that the blood protection existed. She did not concede anything beyond that. She told him she needed to speak with Harry before she could determine whether a formal inquiry was warranted, and that her authority to conduct welfare interviews of wizarding children in wizarding institutions was not something he could decline without constituting a formal legal obstruction of department procedures. He knew this. She could see the rapid, invisible calculation of a very experienced mind moving through available options. There were no good ones. He stepped aside. She went to the hospital wing. Harry Potter had 35 days until his 12th birthday. Amelia had read Pomfrey's report enough times to have memorized the birth date. She noted it again now, looking at him, small and thin-faced, sitting up in his hospital bed in school robes that had been retrieved from somewhere, his round glasses held together at the bridge with tape that had yellowed at the corners. He looked at her with the polite confusion of a child who had been told that an important ministry official was coming and had no idea why. "Harry, this is the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement," Pomfrey said from the foot of the bed. "Hello," Harry said, carefully. Amelia sat down. She kept her notebook and quill as unthreatening as such things could be, which was a matter of holding them as though they were not significant. "I have a few questions about your home. You're not in any trouble." His expression did not entirely relax. She noted that, too. She asked about his room, his meals, what the summer looked like from day to day, whether he had space of his own, whether there were people at the house he could talk to. She asked it in no particular order, because a list made a child feel like a test, and a test made a child reach for the answers they believed were expected. He answered honestly. She had expected that. Children his age usually did, in direct conversation with an adult who was not the adult they feared. What she had not fully anticipated was the texture of his honesty. The way his answers described a life that was, to her trained ear, a welfare concern in every sentence, and registered to him as entirely ordinary. He had his own room now. It had been his cousin's. His cousin had got a second one. The food was fine. He usually just ate what was there. They let him use the garden. He mentioned the chores as part of the natural order of things. He did the weeding. He helped with the cooking. He did them without suggesting this was unusual, without suggesting it was anything at all. They let him go to the park sometimes, after the chores were done. He said it without emphasis. He said it the way you describe the weather. They let him. She wrote throughout and did not change her expression. She asked 3 follow-up questions, offhand and out of order, and he answered those too with the same complete good faith of a child who had never been given reason to understand that what he was describing was not simply what childhood was. She thanked him, told him she hoped he felt better soon, and stepped into the corridor. Pomfrey followed, pulling the door to. "He doesn't know," Amelia said. "No," Pomfrey said. Amelia looked at what she'd written. He said, "They let me go to the park." As a permission, as if it was something that could have been withheld. Pomfrey said nothing. The medical report had said everything on that subject already, and Amelia had been carrying it for 3 weeks. She closed the notebook. She had what she came for, not only the documentation, not only the weight indicators, and the improperly healed nose and the glasses requiring repeated repair. She had the interview. She had a child who said, "They let me," where another child would say, "I usually do, and it's fine," where another child would say, "Yes, always," and who had no sense that the difference meant anything. Harry Potter's confusion was not exculpatory. It was the most substantial evidence she had gathered all morning. "Thank you," she said to Pomfrey. "Don't thank me," Pomfrey said. "Make it count." She found Dumbledore's office without being shown to it. He was standing at the window, which she took to mean he had been watching from above and had composed himself accordingly. He turned when she entered. She told him she had sufficient grounds to open a formal DMLE welfare inquiry into the living conditions of Harry James Potter. That formal notice would follow through standard ministry channels, and that his letter regarding the blood protection charm was in the record, and the investigation would proceed in full awareness of the magical constraints he had described. She was precise about all of it, and not hostile about any of it. He received it with the same precision. He said he would await the formal notice, and hoped the process would take full account of the magical complexity involved. He said it with the controlled gravity of a man who was very intelligent and had just had something occur that he had not been able to prevent, and who was already calculating the next stage. He walked her to the entrance himself. They parted with the exact courtesies of 2 institutional figures who had understood each other entirely and agreed on nothing. She passed through the iron gates and disapparated. Behind her, at an upstairs window, Dumbledore watched the place where she had been. The grounds were very green in the June morning. He had been the most consequential wizard in Britain for the better part of 40 years, and he did not believe this situation had escaped management. Not yet. There were procedures, there were arguments, there was a formal process he understood better than almost anyone. He turned from the window. He had letters to write and calculations to make, and he preferred to do both where he could think clearly. He began. The train pulled into King's Cross at exactly 4 o'clock, and by 4:30 Harry was back in Uncle Vernon's car, watching the motorway unspool in the wrong direction, north to south instead of south to north, away from Scotland and away from everything. Vernon drove in silence. The silence was a different kind than the one on the way up in September, heavier and more deliberate. The silence of a man who was thinking very carefully about what he wasn't saying. Harry looked out the window. He did not know what he was coming back to. He knew the bedroom and the garden, and the particular routine of the Dursleys' house. The meals at the times Vernon had meals, the television at the volume Dudley required, the rhythm of a household that had been running long before Harry was in it, and continued running with the same dedicated indifference to his presence. He knew all of this. He had been away for a year, and nothing about it would have changed, and for the most part that was fine. He did not notice Uncle Vernon's knuckles on the steering wheel. The house on Privet Drive was as it had always been, neat and orderly, the front garden tidy, the windows gleaming, number 4 looking exactly like number 2 and exactly like number 6, because that was what Privet Drive considered appropriate. His trunk was taken from the car to the cupboard under the stairs before Harry had finished getting out of the vehicle. He did not argue. His school things went in after. His wand, his books, Hedwig's empty cage. Vernon locked the cupboard and put the key in his trouser pocket, and did not say anything about it. And Harry did not say anything about it either, because he had learned a long time ago that saying things about it accomplished nothing useful. He went up to Dudley's old room. This part was still new enough to feel strange, having a room at all, at number 4, having a door he could close. The room smelled of Dudley's old football kit, and there were posters of professional wrestlers on the walls, and it was cramped and slightly damp because it was on the shaded side of the house. But it was a room. He put down his bag and sat on the edge of the bed, and through the window he could see the garden. He would be weeding it tomorrow. He knew this without being told because it was summer, and summer at Privet Drive was weeding and cooking and keeping out of the way. And those things didn't change. The bars appeared on his window 4 days after he arrived home. He woke up in the morning, and there they were, iron, new, bolted into the outside of the frame. He stood looking at them for a little while. He thought about asking, and then he thought about what the answer was likely to be, and then he made the bed and went downstairs to start breakfast. A week after the bars, a cat flap appeared on his bedroom door. This one was harder not to react to. A cat flap on a bedroom door. He'd seen them on front doors, on kitchen doors. His first thought was that the Dursleys had got a cat, which seemed unlikely, and also beside the point once he understood what the flap was for. 3 times a day, at the regular meal hours, a plate appeared through the opening, and was then collected afterward, slid in and slid out through the gap without the door ever opening. He got his meals. He got them through a slot in the bottom of his door. He did not think of this as bowed. He thought of it as new and different from last summer, and slightly puzzling, because last summer the Dursleys had at least been in the same room with him at mealtimes, even if no one had spoken. This was a change, and changes, in his experience, were worth noting. He noted it. He did not know what to do with the noting, so he filed it away and got on with things. The summer established its rhythm. He woke early. He made breakfast for Vernon and Petunia and Dudley. He weeded the garden and mowed the lawn and washed the car and did the other things that needed doing, and when they were done, he generally went back upstairs because he was less trouble to everyone that way. He read when he could. There were no wizarding books in the cupboard, and he had no way to ask for them. But Dudley had a small shelf of school books that had been read approximately once between them, and Harry worked through those for lack of anything else. He thought about Hogwarts. He thought about it the way you thought about a place you were going back to. Not with longing, exactly, because longing seemed like the wrong word for something that was simply where his life was. He thought about the great hall and the staircases, and Ron and Hermione, and the particular weight of sitting down to a meal and having it be just a meal, with no slot in a door, with no counting of how much he'd had. He was 31 days from his 12th birthday when the letter came. He didn't see it arrive. He was in the garden, at the far end by the hedge, and when he came back round to the front, he saw Vernon at the letterbox, standing very still with something in his hand, not moving in the way he sometimes didn't move when Harry came around a corner unexpectedly, as if by holding still he might become invisible. Harry said, "Is there post?" And Vernon said, without turning around, "Nothing for you." And Harry went inside. He thought about this in the evenings. It was not the first time Vernon had been strange at the letterbox. Last summer, he'd intercepted what turned out to be Harry's Hogwarts letter, which had led to the most interesting week of Harry's life up to that point. He had learned from the subsequent experience that letters addressed to him from the wizarding world did in fact arrive. He had learned also that Vernon intercepted them. What was left after that summer was not certain, was who might be writing. He didn't think it was Hogwarts. Hogwarts didn't write to students in the summer unless something had happened, and nothing had happened that Harry knew about. He filed Vernon's behaviour at the letterbox alongside the bars and the cat flap, unexplained and probably Dursley-related, and not something he could usefully investigate from his bedroom. He counted the days. Not because the days were unbearable, he genuinely did not think of them as unbearable. They were dull, and the bars on the window made the room feel smaller than it was, and he missed Hedwig, who was staying with Hagrid because he had no way to look after her here, and these things were just the way the summer was. 31 days from his birthday. 30. He was going back to Hogwarts in September. That was the fixed point, the thing that didn't change. All of this was just the distance between now and then. Vernon did not mention the letter again. Harry did not ask. On the 31st of July, his birthday, there was no card from the Dursleys, which was consistent with prior years, and a small note from Ron, which was not, technically, consistent, because prior years he had had no friends. He held the note for a while after reading it. Ron's handwriting was round and slightly lopsided, and it said he hoped Harry was having a decent summer, and mentioned a Quidditch match his brothers had organised in the field behind the burrow, which was a place Harry had never been, but could imagine exactly. 12 years old. He tucked Ron's note into the inside cover of one of Dudley's old school books, and lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling. 32 days until September. 32 days, and then he would be back on the Hogwarts Express, and the train would go north, and the countryside outside the window would look like the beginning of something instead of the end of it. And he would be Harry again, not the boy who did the garden, not the person they slid meals to through the door. Just Harry. He closed his eyes. Outside, the street was quiet, which was what Privet Drive was on a summer evening, orderly and quiet and entirely certain that the world was exactly what it appeared to be. Harry had learned this past year that this was quite often wrong. He held on to that thought. It was enough. For 32 more days. The formal inquiry notice went out on the 17th of July. Amelia had drafted it 3 times, not because she was uncertain of the substance. She had been certain of the substance since she closed her notebook in the hospital wing corridor at Hogwarts and walked back through the castle to tell Dumbledore she had what she needed. She had drafted it 3 times because a formal DMLE welfare inquiry was a serious instrument, and she applied it seriously, which meant the document needed to be exactly right. It was. She sent it. The reply she received was not from Hogwarts. It was from the Office of the Minister for Magic, delivered by internal memo, folded into the shape of a paper aeroplane that arrived on her desk at 9:30 the following morning and unfolded itself on her blotter with the particular self-importance of ministerial correspondence. Cornelius Fudge requested, at her earliest convenience, a brief conversation about the DMLE's recent inquiry activity. His earliest convenience, she noted, was that afternoon at 3:00. She went. Fudge's office was on the second level, with a window that looked out over the atrium, and enough framed commendations on the walls to suggest that someone had once thought a great deal about what the room should communicate. He stood when she entered, which was a gesture she credited him for, even as she recognized it as the gesture of a man who had already decided the shape of the conversation. He offered tea. She accepted. They sat. "I wanted to discuss the Potter inquiry," he said, with the careful neutrality of a man choosing his words in a room he assumed was never entirely private. "I thought you might," she said. "This is a sensitive matter." He turned his teacup in his hands. "The boy who lived. You understand the implications." "I understand the welfare findings," she said, "which are what prompted the inquiry." He acknowledged this with a small incline of his head, the way he acknowledged things he couldn't directly dispute. "Of course. Pomfrey's report. Yes, I have no doubt her concerns are genuine." He paused. "I'm simply asking that you be careful. Procedure must be followed to the letter, naturally. No shortcuts, no haste. These things take time." Procedure to the letter. She received that phrase for what it was. Not an instruction to be thorough, but an instruction to be slow. The letter, followed with maximum fidelity to each procedural requirement and each attendant consultation and each interdepartmental notification, was a mechanism that could stretch weeks into months without anyone technically doing anything wrong. "I always follow procedure," she said pleasantly. "Of course." He smiled. "Of course you do. Amelia, the fact is, there are real jurisdictional complications here that can't be rushed. The Dursleys are muggles as I understand it. Any formal action against Harry's guardians means coordinating with Muggle law enforcement, which means the statute of secrecy becomes a consideration, which means the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes needs to be involved at minimum, and probably the Office for the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts, and the inquiry is into Harry Potter's welfare," she said, "not the Dursleys' prosecution. My authority over Harry as a wizarding minor is clear." "Certainly," he nodded. "And your authority over his Muggle guardians, if your inquiry findings require action against them?" She held his gaze. "Is that all you wanted to discuss, Minister?" It was not quite a dismissal. It was the version of a dismissal that could not be taken as one. He heard it exactly as she intended, and wrapped up the conversation with the brisk efficiency of a man who had accomplished what he'd come to accomplish. She walked back through the ministry to her own office, sat down at her desk, and made a notation in the inquiry file. Minister's office contacted on 18th July. Meeting conducted. Concern noted. Inquiry proceeds. Everything was in the record. That was the point of the record. The jurisdictional problem, as it happened, was genuine, which was the thing about Fudge's obstructions that required intellectual honesty to sit with. He was wrong about the significance of the inquiry and right about the legal terrain. Harry was a wizarding minor. The DMLE's authority over his welfare was solid. The Dursleys were muggles. Any proceedings that reached toward formal sanctions against them would require the kind of interdepartmental choreography that was slow by design, because statute of secrecy violations, even adjacent ones, even theoretical ones, had to be managed carefully. Fudge hadn't invented this problem. He had only identified it as a break and applied his weight. She worked with what she had. She could document. She could build the file. She could wait for September and for Harry Potter's return to Hogwarts, and for whatever the next examination produced, because what she currently had was one report and one interview, and a letter Vernon Dursley hadn't replied to, and what she needed was a pattern documented across time by a trained professional. She was building that. Slowly, but building. Dumbledore's letter arrived in the first week of August. It was long, which she had expected, and precise, which she had also expected, and it was the single most carefully constructed piece of correspondence she had received in 12 years of running the DMLE. He acknowledged Pomfrey's report as the work of a highly competent healer operating in good professional conscience. He did not dispute the medical findings. He did not suggest Pomfrey had been mistaken, or that Harry's physical condition was not what the report described. He accepted all of it, and then he explained why it could not be addressed in the way a different set of circumstances would allow. The blood protection charm was real. It had been created by Lily Potter's act of self-sacrifice on the night of October 31st, 1981, and it was anchored to the home of a blood relative, the only blood relative Harry had. The charm did not merely protect Harry from physical attack while he was at Privet Drive. It protected him as long as he was able to call that house his home, and it protected him specifically against Voldemort, whose body was destroyed, but whose spirit was not, who was, in Dumbledore's precise language, diminished but not extinguished, and who would return in some form at some point that could not be predicted, but could be anticipated. To disrupt the arrangement that maintained the charm was to strip Harry of the only active magical protection available to him during the years before he was old enough and skilled enough to protect himself. He did not call what had been done to Harry acceptable. He said explicitly that he did not call it acceptable. He said that he had failed to attend to Harry's conditions as carefully as he should have, and that this was a failure he had not excused himself for, and did not intend to excuse himself for. He was asking only that the DMLE consider whether the available remedies were proportionate to the risk that removing or disrupting the current arrangement would create for the child's life. He signed it, beneath the full list of his titles, with the words, "I remain, as ever, at the disposal of this inquiry." She read it twice. She set it down. She looked at the window. It was a real argument about real magic from the most knowledgeable wizard in Britain, and she could not dismiss it. She had encountered enough magical experts in her career to know that when Dumbledore said the charm required a blood relative's home and would collapse without it, this was not a position likely to be contradicted by independent assessment. The magic was the magic. The constraint was the constraint. What she needed, and did not yet have, was the answer to a question Dumbledore's letter carefully did not address. The charm required Harry to live with Petunia Dursley. It did not specify what living with Petunia Dursley had to look like. The protection from Voldemort and the license to neglect were two things, and Dumbledore's letter had spent 8 pages treating them as though they were one. She had not found a way to name that distinction yet, not in terms that would force the argument to be resolved rather than continued. She would. She added the letter to the file. She locked the file in her cabinet. She went back to work. September was 6 weeks away. She had been patient before. She had scheduled the appointment in June. Not conspicuously, she had simply noted in the Hogwarts medical register that Harry Potter was to present for a follow-up welfare assessment at the start of the autumn term on grounds of his Year 1 hospitalization and associated findings. It was well within her purview as school matron. No one had questioned it. She had written it in the register in her usual hand, with the date and the time and the notation, routine follow-up, and she had come back to school 3 days early to make sure the hospital wing was ready for September and to wait for the train. The Hogwarts Express arrived on the 1st of September, 1992. Harry was 12 years old. She could see, even across the length of the ward, that the summer had left its mark. She had the June measurements on file, and she had looked at them the night before. Height, weight, the precise documented evidence of chronic underdevelopment at the end of year 1. The boy who came into her hospital wing now was taller than he had been in June. He was also lighter. Not dramatically. He had grown and not gained correspondingly. The body doing what bodies insist on doing regardless of what they are fed, climbing toward 12 years old on whatever it had available. She made note of this as he sat down in the chair beside her desk and accepted the routine measurement instruments with the resigned patience of someone accustomed to medical procedures they didn't fully understand. "How was your summer?" she asked, which was not a clinical question and was not intended to be. "Fine," he said. "Quiet." He seemed to consider this. "I did the garden." She wrote that down. She asked about meals, in the way she asked about meals, in the context of questions about exercise and sleep and general activity, so that it was simply one element of a broader intake. He answered the way he always answered, which was with an unguarded accuracy that she found simultaneously useful and difficult to read without affecting the reading. He said meals were normal. He said the Dursleys had his own system for... He paused here, as if deciding whether the next part was relevant, for getting him his food. A kind of hatch in the door. He said it the way he might have said that the Dursleys had a particular brand of cereal they preferred, as a fact about a household, and not a fact about himself. She wrote it down. She did not change her expression. She noted the height. She noted the weight. She noted, in the clinical shorthand she had developed over decades of healer notation, the persistence of the indicators documented in June. The thin face, the wrists still more visible than a 12-year-old's should be, the calluses on the hands. She noted the growth as a positive. She noted the weight as a concern. She asked about his glasses. Still the same ones, he confirmed, though the tape had been replaced at least once over the summer, and she noted that too. She asked about injuries. He had none from the summer that he mentioned, which was its own kind of information. After 20 minutes she thanked him and told him he was all clear to begin the term. "That's it?" he said, with the faint surprise of someone who had expected more. "That's it," she said. "Go find your friends. I'm sure Mr. Weasley has an opinion about the Quidditch season." He smiled at that, the quick, bright smile that was one of the things she had noticed about Harry Potter from the first time she treated him. The ease with which he smiled, the readiness of it, the way it appeared without any of the deliberation you might expect from a child who had not been given many reasons to smile. He left. She heard his footsteps down the corridor, and then the sound of the main doors, and then quiet. She sat at her desk. She pulled out the June report from the patient file drawer and set it beside her new notes and looked at both of them. A cat flap on his bedroom door. Food delivered through an opening in the wood because the door itself was not opened. The school things locked in the cupboard under the stairs upon arrival, which she knew from the June interview. The window barred. He had mentioned this without particular emphasis, as if bars on a bedroom window were simply a design feature he had not thought to bring up before. She had asked if there were any changes to his living space since last year, and he had said his cousin's second room still smelled a bit of old boots, and yes, there were bars on the window now, and he had shrugged, and she had written it down without a shrug. 2 reports, one examination in June that documented the conditions at the end of a full school year's deprivation, one examination in September that documented what the summer had added, a lower weight than June despite a taller frame, a cat flap, bars, the food sent through the gap in the door. This was not neglect of the kind that came from poverty, or from distraction, or from ignorance of what a child required. This was deliberate. Someone had installed the cat flap. Someone had fitted the iron bars to the outside of the bedroom window. Someone had decided, consciously, that the system for feeding a 12-year-old through a hole in his door was the appropriate arrangement, and had continued to believe this through an entire summer. She had spent more than 2 decades in this hospital wing, documenting the accidents and misfortunes and occasional cruelties that befell Hogwarts students. She knew the difference between a family that was struggling and a family that had decided. She wrote the second report that evening. It was, like the first, clinical. It documented dates and findings and measurements and specific observations in the careful language of someone who had spent decades understanding that the record was only as useful as it was precise. When she had finished, she read it through once, and then she read the June report again. And then she set them side by side and looked at them together, the way Amelia Bones would look at them together when they arrived. 2 data points made a line. She addressed the second report to the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, Ministry of Magic, and sealed it with the hospital wing's official stamp. She sent the owl from the window above her desk, the same window she had used in June, and watched it go until it disappeared into the September dark. She did not tell Harry. Harry, for his part, found Ron in the Gryffindor common room with chocolate frogs and strong opinions about whether Gryffindor had a realistic chance at the House Cup if Wood actually managed to implement the strategy he'd been talking about all last year. Hermione arrived shortly afterward with her new timetable, which she had already annotated, and which she was going to have a careful conversation with Professor McGonagall about, because 2 of the electives she'd been hoping to take were timetabled against core subjects, and she was going to need to ask about alternatives. Hagrid was visible through the common room window in the last of the evening light, his enormous shape moving across the grounds toward his hut, a lamp swinging in one hand. Harry watched him for a moment. Hagrid had collected him from Privet Drive in that first Letter Chaos summer before Year 1, and had been here every year since, large and certain as the castle itself. He thought about the examination. Pomfrey had taken more notes than usual. He wasn't sure why. She'd been efficient, the way she always was, but there was something in the set of her, something held at a careful distance that hadn't been there last year, or that he hadn't noticed last year, or that he was only beginning to notice because he was 12 now and perhaps had better instruments for reading adults than he'd had at 11. He filed it away alongside the other unexplained things, the parchment on her desk in June, Vernon Strange at the letterbox, the letter that apparently hadn't been letter at all. There was probably a sensible explanation for all of it. There usually was. With adults. He turned back to Ron and the question of the Quidditch season, and the evening settled into the beginning of a new year, which felt as New Year's at Hogwarts always felt, like something he had earned. 2 reports made a pattern. Amelia had known, when she filed the first report in her cabinet in July, that what she had was serious, but not yet definitive. One document from one source, however credible, was not what a formal warrant required. The second report changed this. She could now place the September findings alongside the June findings and demonstrate not merely a condition, but a trajectory. A child examined at the end of the school year, showing chronic malnourishment and historic untreated injuries, and then examined again at the start of the following term, showing a lower weight than the examination 3 months prior, with the addition of a barred window and a food hatch in his bedroom door. The conditions had been deliberately worsened during the period Harry Potter was in his guardian's sole care. She applied for a formal inquiry warrant through the Wizengamot Administration Services, which was the sub-office of the DMLE that handled formal Wizengamot procedures and was staffed by people accustomed to the very precise language such applications required. The application cited both reports, cited the unacknowledged DMLE correspondence sent to 4 Privet Drive in July, cited the interview conducted with Harry at Hogwarts in June. She submitted it on the 23rd of September, which was a Wednesday, and she expected an initial response within 10 working days. The initial response, when it came, was not from the Wizengamot Administration Services. It was from the office of the Chief Warlock. Dumbledore had not submitted a formal objection to the warrant application. That would have been too direct and too easily characterized as interference. What he had submitted was a formal request, through procedural channels available to the Chief Warlock in his oversight capacity, that the blood protection magic described in his August letter be assessed by an independent magical expert prior to any formal proceeding that might affect Harry Potter's living arrangements. This was within his authority. It was also procedurally legitimate in a way that meant it could not be summarily dismissed. The expert assessment requirement had been established in precedent, and Amelia's own office had invoked it in 3 prior cases. The warrant application was placed on hold pending the assessment. The assessment would take 6 to 8 weeks. She filed a formal notation. Warrant application submitted, 23rd September 1992. Placed on hold pending independent expert assessment on blood protection magic per request of the Chief Warlock. Estimated delay, 6 to 8 weeks. Everything was in the record. She went back to work. In the 4th week of October, she dispatched a DMLE representative to conduct a formal interview with Professor Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, in her capacity as the staff member who had been present at 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey, on the night of the 1st and 2nd of November, 1981. The representative arrived at Hogwarts on the 28th of October and was shown to McGonagall's office. McGonagall was 57 years old. The DMLE representative was experienced and had conducted many interviews in formal and semi-formal settings, and he noted in his subsequent report that Professor McGonagall received him without apparent surprise and without requesting that the interview be deferred to allow for legal representation. She indicated that she was aware of the general subject of the inquiry and had no objection to cooperating with it. She sat down at her desk. He sat across from her. He explained the purpose and scope of the interview, asked whether she understood her rights as an interviewee, and began. He asked her whether she had been present at 4 Privet Drive on the night of November 1st, 1981. She confirmed that she had. He asked whether she had accompanied Headmaster Dumbledore and Rubeus Hagrid on that occasion. She confirmed that she had. He asked whether she had observed the property and its residents prior to that night. She confirmed that she had spent the full day of November 1st, 1981, observing the property in her animagus form. A tabby cat, she clarified, without being asked, from a position adjacent to the front entrance. He asked her to describe her assessment of the household, to the best of her recollection, on that date. She said that she had formed the view that the Dursleys were, in her precise words, the worst sort of muggles imaginable. She said it clearly, in the way she said things she had decided to say. He wrote it down. He asked whether she had communicated any concern about the placement to Headmaster Dumbledore. She said yes. He asked what she had said. She said she had asked him whether he could really want to leave Harry Potter with those people. She said she had described them as she has just described them, and that she had expressed the view that Harry would grow up not knowing who he was or what he had done. He wrote all of this down. He asked what Dumbledore had said in response. She described it briefly. He asked whether she had taken any further action after that conversation, or raised any further concerns about Harry Potter's living situation in the subsequent 10 years. There was a pause. She said no. He noted the pause. He noted the answer. He thanked her for her time and closed his notebook. She showed him to the door. She came back into her office. She sat down at her desk. The fire in the grate had burned down while they spoke, and the room was slightly cooler than it had been, and she did not immediately reach for her wand to correct this. She sat with her hands folded on the desk in the way she sat at the beginning of things that required steadiness. 10 years. She had thought about the November night she had put Harry Potter on the doorstep at Dumbledore's instruction more times than she had tallied in the way you thought about things you hadn't acted differently on. She had objected. She had said it plainly. These people really? And Dumbledore had explained the blood protection, the necessity, the reasons she had accepted, because they were real reasons from the most trusted man she knew, and she had been 30 years younger, and she had been on the other side of the worst 12 months in Wizarding Britain's recent history, and she had been very tired. These were all true things. They did not change what the man from the DMLE had just written in his notebook. She had observed the Dursleys for a full day. She had described them with precision. She had raised the objection. She had then, each year for 10 years, passed Harry Potter in the corridors of her school and asked herself nothing about what the previous summer had looked like, and moved on to the next thing, and the next, and the term, and the year. It was different now to have said it out loud with someone's pen moving across a page. Outside her office window, the grounds were moving through the thin cold of a Hogwarts autumn. She could hear, distantly, the sounds of the school going about its evening. Students in the common rooms, doors somewhere along the corridor, the general quiet hum of a building that housed several hundred children who were currently attending to their own various crises. The Year 2 students had been navigating a difficult term. Petrified students in the hospital wing, Pomfrey under considerable strain, rumours multiplying with every new incident. Harry Potter was somewhere in this building, 12 years old, entirely unaware that a DMLE representative had just spent 40 minutes in this room writing things down about him and the November night he had been left on a doorstep. She had not seen Harry since the interview began. She thought about that. She thought about all of it, for the first time in a long time, in something approaching its full size. She reached for her wand and rebuilt the fire. At the ministry, Fudge received the formal notification of the warrant application when it was restored to active status following the expert assessment, which had confirmed, precisely as everyone involved had expected, that the blood protection charm was real, required Harry's residence with a blood relative, and was consequential. He pressed Amelia again. More urgently than in July, the warrant application meant the Wizengamot's formal apparatus was now in motion, and that was considerably harder to quietly contain than a departmental inquiry. She refused, as she had refused in July, to close the inquiry. She told him the expert assessment had concluded and the application would proceed. He said he hoped she understood the political implications. She said she understood the welfare implications, which were what she was responsible for. She went back to her office. The inquiry moved forward at the pace Dumbledore's procedural manoeuvring had made it move, which was slow, but it moved. That was the point of the record. Things that were in it couldn't be taken out. The expert's report arrived in the second week of December. It was thorough, which she had expected, and it confirmed everything Dumbledore had said in his August letter, which she had also expected. The blood protection charm created by Lily Potter's sacrifice on the night of October 31st, 1981 was real, was active, and required Harry Potter to reside with and return each summer to the home of a living blood relative on his mother's side. The assessment was conducted by a charms specialist attached to the Department of Mysteries, whose credentials were impeccable and whose conclusion was unambiguous. The charm was what Dumbledore said it was. She read the report once, straight through, and then she turned to the last page and read the clause she had been waiting for since she first read Dumbledore's august letter. The clause that the expert had included almost as an afterthought, because it was so obvious it barely warranted spelling out. The charm required only that Harry Potter return to the home of a blood relative and call it home. It specified nothing else. It imposed no requirements as to the conditions within that home. She put the report down. She drafted a letter requesting a formal private meeting with Albus Dumbledore at the Ministry of Magic at his earliest reasonable convenience. She kept the word reasonable. She sent it by Ministry Owl the same afternoon. He came in January. He arrived at the ministry with the ease of a man who had been in rooms more significant than anything the ministry's second level had to offer, and who had arranged his face accordingly. Open, attentive, with the blue eyes behind the half-moon spectacles, carrying the particular quality of a very intelligent person who has decided to listen carefully before speaking. He was approximately 111 years old. He had been headmaster, chief warlock, and supreme mugwump through decades of conflict and resolution, and conflict again. He sat down across the table from Amelia Bones and folded his hands and waited. She presented both reports. She had them in order, bound in the DMLE's official documentation covers, and she set them on the table between them, where they could both see. June 1992, September 1992. She did not narrate them. He had read her inquiry correspondence and knew what they contained. She let them sit. She acknowledged the expert assessment. She said that she had read it carefully and had no objection to its conclusions, and that she understood the blood protection charm to be real and consequential, and to require Harry's annual return to his blood relative's home. She said all of this plainly, and he nodded, and she could see him beginning to understand that she was building toward something rather than conceding. She said, "The charm requires Harry Potter to call his aunt's house his home, and to return to it each summer." She had read the assessment's operative clauses 3 times, and she wanted to be precise. It requires his residence there. It requires a blood relationship. It requires that he think of it as home. She paused. She let him hear what she had not yet said. She said, "It does not require that his bedroom window be barred. It does not require that his food be delivered through a slot in the door. It does not require that he be denied adequate nutrition, or that his injuries go untreated for years, or that he be made to understand, by 1,000 small mechanisms and one very large one, that he is tolerated rather than cared for. The protection from Voldemort and the license to neglect are 2 entirely separate things. His letter to her and the expert assessment and the 10 years of the arrangement before she became involved had treated them as one. They were not one." The room was quiet. Dumbledore did not answer immediately. She had expected this. He was a man who thought before he spoke, and the thing she had said was not answerable quickly if it was going to be answered honestly. She watched him sit with it. He was looking at the 2 reports on the table between them, the June report and the September one, and she watched something move across his face that was more complicated than she had seen there in any of their previous encounters. Not the controlled assessment of a man managing a situation, but something older and more private. Something that looked very much like a man examining a thing he had not examined in a long time and finding it different from what he remembered. He said that if the Dursleys were formally investigated and disciplined through ministry channels, they might refuse to house Harry. He said it quietly, and he meant it as a real concern rather than as a tactic. If Petunia Dursley, under pressure of ministry oversight, decided she would not have Harry in her home, the charm would collapse. She was the only blood relative of Lily Potter's living. If she chose not to house her nephew, not merely lived with him, but genuinely chose, in some sense that the magic could recognize as consent, the protection might not hold. And Voldemort's spirit was bodiless and diminished, but diminished was not gone, and he had not underestimated Voldemort in 40 years, and was not going to begin now. She said she was not proposing to investigate or prosecute the Dursleys. He looked at her. She said she was proposing a formal oversight arrangement. Quarterly welfare assessments of Harry's living conditions at 4 Privet Drive, conducted by the DMLE, with formal notification to the Dursley household that the assessments would occur. Harry would remain with Petunia Dursley. Petunia Dursley would remain his legal guardian. The blood protection charm would remain intact. The Dursleys would not be prosecuted, fined, or compelled to leave their home. What they would be compelled to do was be present and cooperative, and aware that their nephew's welfare was being formally monitored by the arm of the ministry that oversaw magical law enforcement. The cat flap would come off the door. The bars would come off the window. The conditions both reports documented would end. The charm would be preserved. Harry would be safer in both the ways that mattered. He was quiet for longer than he had been before. She watched him and did not fill the silence, because the silence was doing something useful. He was a man who had been managing this situation alone for 11 years, and what she had just offered him was a version of the future in which he did not have to manage it alone, which was also a version in which he was no longer the only authority over Harry's life. And those were two aspects of the same thing, and both of them were true, and she could see him understanding both at once. He said he would need time to consider the arrangement. She said she could give him 1 month. If he had not formally accepted the oversight arrangement by the end of the Year 2 school year, she would bring the matter to a full Wizengamot committee hearing. He would be called as a witness and an interested party. The hearing would be a matter of public record. He accepted the deadline. He stood and they shook hands, and she thanked him for his time, and he left the meeting room with the same ease he had brought into it, but with something different behind the eyes. She stayed for a while after he left, not because she needed to, but because the room was quiet and the meeting had required a great deal of precision, and she found that precision, at the end of long meetings, needed somewhere to go. She had made the distinction. She had named it clearly enough that it could not be ignored. Whether he would accept it without the hearing remained to be seen. She gathered her papers and went back to work. At Hogwarts, later that night, Severus Snape walked the 3rd-floor corridor with a lamp and a set of essays he had no intention of marking until morning. He was 33 years old, and he had been at this school, in one capacity or another, for more than half his life. He was aware that the DMLE inquiry existed. A matter concerning Harry Potter could not move through the school's administrative atmosphere without reaching him, whatever else he might prefer. He had not been asked to provide information to Amelia Bones. He had not volunteered any. He had nothing to volunteer that was not already in the 2 medical reports. Lily Potter's son had been at the Dursleys for 11 years. He had known this when the arrangement was made. He had known, in the abstract way one knew things about a child one had decided not to think about, what Petunia Evans was like, what her husband appeared to be like, what 4 Privet Drive looked like from the outside. He had not said anything in 1981. He had not said anything in the years since. He walked the corridor. The castle was quiet at this hour, which was the hour he preferred, because the castle at this hour asked nothing of him. that he was not already prepared to give. He turned at the end of the corridor and walked back. Some things existed in the record whether or not you had put them there. Dumbledore's deadline passed on the last day of February. He had not formally refused the oversight arrangement. He had written twice, once with procedural questions about how the quarterly assessments would be conducted, and once with a request that a second independent expert be commissioned to assess whether any form of ministry contact with the Dursley household might affect the blood protection charm's stability. Both letters were impeccably worded and reflected genuine concerns, and both letters were also, as a practical matter, delay. Amelia had been expecting something of this kind. She had given him a month, and he had given her correspondence. She filed her formal notice with the Wizengamot Administration Services on the 3rd of March. She called the committee hearing for the 26th of April. She informed Dumbledore's office, Fudge's office, and Pomfrey's office, in that order, by official owl. The hearing chamber in the Ministry of Magic's 9th level was circular and tiered and designed, like most things in the ministry, to communicate the weight of proceedings conducted within it. Amelia had been in this room many times. She was a member of the Wizengamot and had sat both sides of the witness position. Today she presided from the central chair, and the room filled around her with the particular quiet efficiency of a formal proceeding that everyone present understood to be significant. Cornelius Fudge arrived with 2 aides and sat at the edge of the committee section, which was within his rights as Minister for Magic. In the first 10 minutes, he submitted a formal request that the hearing's scope be limited to Harry Potter's medical welfare and exclude any broader consideration of the ministry's administrative record in relation to Harry's placement. Amelia denied the request formally, on the record, and noted in her denial that the ministry's administrative record was directly relevant to the question of whether the welfare findings constituted a systemic rather than incidental failure. He received this without visible pleasure and did not pursue it further. Albus Dumbledore, as chief warlock of the Wizengamot, was recused from presiding over a hearing in which he was both an interested party and a potential witness. He sat in the witness section with the composure of a man who had been in hearing chambers before and found them, whatever their furniture, essentially the same room. Poppy Pomfrey was called first. She entered the chamber without ceremony and crossed to the witness chair in the efficient manner of someone who had decided, before she arrived, exactly what she was going to do in this room and intended to do precisely that. She stated her name, her title, and her qualifications, and she was asked to present the medical documentation she had filed in relation to Harry James Potter. She presented both reports, the June 1992 examination and the September 1992 examination, bound in the hospital wing's official documentation format, submitted as evidence under the Wizengamot's formal record. She described both examinations in clinical terms, what she had observed, what the measurements indicated, what the specific findings, the weight, the healed-off angle rib, the improperly set nose, the calluses, the tape-repaired glasses, and then the September follow-up with the cat flap and the barred window, and the lower weight against a taller frame, meant in terms of a child's health and development history. She used the precise vocabulary of someone who had spent decades translating what bodies said into what records could hold, and the room was quiet in the way rooms were when people understood they were hearing something important. She was asked whether she had treated other children presenting with similar findings during her tenure as Hogwarts matron. She said no. She was asked whether, in her professional judgment, the conditions documented in both reports represented an ongoing risk to the health and development of the child in her care. She said yes, without qualification. She was excused. She walked out of the hearing chamber in the same efficient manner she had walked in, and the door closed behind her, and the chamber was quiet for a moment. Dumbledore was called next. He took the witness chair with the ease of a man who understood that rooms like this one derived their authority from the consent of the people within them, and who had no intention of withdrawing his consent from the Wizengamot's proceedings. He stated his name and his titles, all of them, in full, and he answered the committee's questions with the same measured, comprehensive honesty that had characterized every stage of his participation in the inquiry. He explained the blood protection charm, its origins, its mechanism, its requirements. He confirmed Pomfrey's medical findings. He did not dispute them. He did not suggest they were exaggerated or misinterpreted. He acknowledged them as the documented professional assessment of a highly competent healer acting in entirely good conscience. He said clearly, as he had said in his August letter, that he had not overseen Harry's welfare at the Dursleys with the diligence he should have. He then explained why, in his judgment, the alternative posed a greater threat to Harry's life. Petunia Dursley was the only living blood relative on his mother's side. The charm required her willing housing of Harry each summer, required that he be able to genuinely call her house his home. If the Dursleys were formally sanctioned to a degree that led Petunia to refuse Harry's return, the charm would not merely weaken, it would fail. Voldemort was bodiless and diminished, but was not destroyed. That was not a permanent state. In the years before Harry was old enough to defend himself, the blood protection was not a preferable arrangement. It was the only arrangement. The committee heard Fudge last. He did not use the word proportionate. The hearing had progressed past the point where that vocabulary was serviceable. He said the ministry was committed to Harry Potter's welfare and trusted the committee to weigh the considerations before it carefully. He sat down. The committee withdrew to consider. Amelia did not withdraw. She presided, and presiding meant staying, and she spent the committee's deliberation reviewing her notes, which she had no need to review, but which gave her hands something to do. The ruling was delivered in writing, as Wizengamot committee rulings were, with the committee's formal stamp and signature of record. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement shall conduct mandatory quarterly welfare assessments of Harry James Potter's living conditions at 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey, for so long as he resides there as a minor wizarding citizen. The Dursley household shall receive formal notification of these assessments and is required to cooperate with DMLE assessment personnel. In the event that any assessment documents conditions below the established child welfare standard, the board retains authority to revisit Harry Potter's living arrangement under emergency welfare powers. Albus Percival, Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, is required to formally acknowledge the assessment schedule and to cooperate with its implementation. She read it twice. She added it to the file. She stood, and the room began to empty around her in the ordinary efficient manner of people moving from one meeting to the next, and she collected her papers and walked out into the corridor. The corridor outside the hearing chamber was plain stone, windowless, lit by lamps at intervals. She stood in it for a moment before moving, in the way she sometimes stood after long proceedings, not because she needed to recover herself, but because there was a quality to certain kinds of institutional work that wanted a moment of acknowledgement before the next thing. Her brother Edgar had been killed in 1981, along with his wife and his children. In the weeks afterward, she had read every official report that existed about what had happened. They documented how the institutions that should have been watching had been watching something else, and how the people with the authority to protect his family had made the procedural calculations that careful institutional people made, and how by the time anyone with sufficient authority understood what was happening, it was over. She had filed those reports and continued working, because that was what you did. This ruling was not enough. She knew what enough would have looked like, And this was not it. This was oversight, which was a mechanism, and mechanisms depended on the people who operated them. And Harry Potter was 12 years old, and going back to Privet Drive in June, and the Dursleys would have the bars off the window and the cat flap off the door, because they had been formally told to remove them. And that was a different thing from a home. It was something. It was more than what had existed at 8 o'clock that morning. She went back to work. He came back through the entrance to the hospital wing in the manner of someone who was still somewhat surprised to be walking, and Pomfrey met him at the doors. She had been told enough of what happened in the chamber, the basilisk, the sword, the fang, the diary destroyed, Ginny Weasley recovered, and currently with her family, the petrified students given the mandrake restorative draught, and expected fully healed by morning. She received all of this with professional efficiency, and then she looked at Harry, who was 12 years old and had blood on his robes, and she set her face to the careful neutral of someone who would not let him see anything that would make him worry about himself. She did her examination. It was thorough, because everything she did was thorough, and it was also, under the terms of the Wizengamot Committee ruling issued in April, now formally part of the welfare record, as well as the medical one. She documented the injuries from the basilisk encounter separately, clearly, in the way that distinguished acute from chronic. This was the basilisk. This was the fall. This is the healing that needs attending to. She noted in the official welfare section that Harry's general condition was better than September. Hogwarts meals had done their work. Her cumulative file now ran to 3 examinations and considerable ministry correspondence, and between the September findings and tonight's, she could see that something had shifted. She told him he was going to be fine, which was true. She gave him the standard post-trauma potions and told him to sleep, which he did not immediately do because he had just killed a basilisk, and sleeping after that required a particular kind of mental tiredness that hadn't arrived yet. He lay in the bed and looked at the ceiling for a while. Then, because the ceiling only had so much to offer, he looked at Pomfrey's desk. There were more documents on it than there usually were. There had always been the ordinary clutter of a working healer's space. But these were different. He could see, from across the ward, the official texture of ministry documentation, the sealed and counter-sealed look of things that had formal authority behind them. He counted at least 2 with what looked like ministry stamps on the visible edges. He said, "Madam Pomfrey?" She came over. "What's all that?" he said, nodding toward the desk. "On your desk. Is it about me?" She looked at him. He was 12 years old, and he had just come out of a pipe in the floor of a girl's bathroom into a chamber full of skeletons and a 50-foot snake, and he had come back upright, and she thought, not for the first time, that she was not sure what it said about this particular child that he was asking about paperwork. She pulled the chair beside his bed and sat down, which was not what she usually did. "Last year," she said, "after you came in following your encounter with Professor Quirrell, you were unconscious for 3 days. I examined you properly for the first time." He watched her. He had the look of someone who was not sure yet whether he was in trouble. "I filed a medical report on your physical condition, your general health, based on that examination. Evidence of chronic undernourishment. Injuries that hadn't been properly treated." She said it directly, without softening it into something smaller. "I sent a copy to the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement." A pause. "Why?" he said. "Because it was my professional obligation," she said, "and because you're 12 years old, and what I found was not the result of one bad year." His expression was something she did not have an easy name for. Not distress, exactly. Not anger. Something slightly younger and more disoriented than either. the look of a person who has been told that a thing they had considered private was visible to someone else, and is working out how to accommodate that. "Am I in trouble?" he said. "No," she said. Are the Dursleys in trouble?" She considered this. "The Ministry is keeping an eye on things," she said. "There is a formal arrangement in place. People will be checking that your living conditions are appropriate." He absorbed this. She could not quite read what he made of it. There was something underneath the confusion. Something she thought might be a feeling he didn't have a word for yet, too unfamiliar to name or reach for. She did not push him. She told him to sleep. She went back to her desk. Dumbledore came the following afternoon, in the way he always came after the difficult things, quietly, with the ease of someone who had been on the far side of difficult things before and had developed, over a century, a manner of sitting with people in the aftermath. He spoke of the basilisk and the diary and Ginny Weasley, who was with her family and recovering. He spoke warmly and carefully and said the things that Harry needed to hear. And then toward the end he said, "I should mention, there are people who will be checking in on your summer, an arrangement that has been made." He said it the way you mentioned an administrative matter that concerned everyone without particularly inconveniencing anyone. He said it with the same gentle ease he had said everything else, framing it as a thing that had been decided by institutional processes and was now simply part of how things worked. Harry was looking at him. Not in the way Harry usually looked at Dumbledore, with the attentiveness of someone who trusted the source absolutely. He was looking with something more careful and searching, as if trying to locate a specific thing behind what he was being told and not quite finding it. He acknowledged that he understood. He said nothing more. Pomfrey, watching from across the ward, saw the look and understood it. He was 12, and he had just been told the same thing by two separate people in two different ways, and he was beginning to understand that the two tellings were not separate. Dumbledore stayed for an appropriate length of time, said the things that needed saying, and left. The ward settled back into quiet. That evening, from her office on the first floor, Minerva McGonagall sat down to write the letter. She had been composing it in the way one composed things one did not yet write since October, since the afternoon she had sat across from the DMLE representative and said out loud that she had described the Dursleys as the worst sort of muggles imaginable, and then done nothing further for 10 years, and had watched him write it down. She had carried the letter since then as a weight she had not yet decided how to set down. She did not write it to the DMLE. She wrote it to Harry. She was precise, and she did not make excuses, and she did not write the letter she would have written to a colleague, formal and at arm's length. She wrote the November night in 1981, as it had actually been, the day she had spent watching the Dursleys in her animagus form, the quality of what she had observed, the words she had said to Dumbledore when he arrived with the baby. You can't really want to leave him with these people. And the letter Dumbledore had left on the doorstep for Petunia. And then the moment she had walked away from all of it, because Dumbledore had explained, and she had accepted the explanation, and she had been tired, and it had been a very bad year. She wrote that raising an objection and then walking away from it was not the same as acting on it. She had known this in October, and she knew it now, and she was not going to pretend to herself that she hadn't known it then. She had objected. The objection had accomplished nothing, because she had not made it accomplish anything. 10 years ago, and also, she understood now, right up until June of last year, when Pomfrey had done what Pomfrey had done. She told him she was sorry she had not done more. She wrote it plainly, in her usual hand, the same hand she used for timetables and committee minutes, and the kinds of communication that required that she say exactly what she meant. She did not ask for anything from him, not a reply, not forgiveness, not any particular response. What she had owed him was an accounting, and what she was sending him was the accounting, and what happened after that was for him to decide or not decide in whatever way a 12-year-old decided things. She folded the letter. She sealed it. She took it to her desk and placed it in the back of the second drawer, with a note on the outside that said, "July in her own hand," so she would not forget. She sat for a moment in the quiet of her office. The sum of these things was small against what had not happened for 10 years, but it was larger, by any honest accounting, than it had been the year before. She went to read the third-year timetables. There was always at the end of the year work to do for the beginning of the next one. The summer was different. Harry noticed this incrementally, the way you noticed temperature dropping in autumn. Not in any single moment, but in the accumulation of small things that, taken together, added up to a change. The bars were off his window. He had not asked about this, and no one had mentioned it. But when he arrived in June, the window opened freely, all the way, onto the back garden in the summer morning, and the absence of the iron was something he felt in his chest in a way he didn't entirely have words for. The cat flap was gone too, the door solid again, and he ate his meals at the kitchen table with the Dursleys, which was not warm. It was not remotely warm, and Aunt Petunia's mouth was set at an angle that suggested she had opinions about the arrangement that she had chosen not to voice. But it was at the table, with a plate, with enough on it. Not as much as he might have liked, but enough. A woman had come in the first week of July. She had arrived in Muggle clothes, and with a clipboard, and had knocked on the door in the manner of a professional appointment that everyone involved already knew was occurring. Uncle Vernon had answered the door. Harry, watching from the top of the stairs, had seen Vernon's expression perform a rapid series of calculations before settling into something that was neither welcoming nor obstructive, and he had stepped aside and let her in. She had walked through the house. She had asked Harry a series of questions in the sitting room, while Vernon stood in the doorway with his arms folded, and the particular stillness of someone under observation who was very aware of being under observation. She had asked whether the window bars had been removed. Harry had confirmed that they had. She had written this down. She had not said anything else particularly remarkable, and after perhaps 20 minutes, she had thanked them for their time and left, and Vernon had closed the door, and the house had been very quiet for a long time afterward. No one mentioned her again. But 2 weeks later, at dinner, Harry was given a second helping without asking. He ate it. He did not comment on it. He understood, in the particular way he understood things he had learned to understand without a framework, that something outside this house had reached inside it. In the third week of July, McGonagall's letter arrived. He was in his room when the owl came. Hedwig, back from wherever she'd been, with a sealed envelope he didn't recognize. He opened it at his desk with the window open and the late afternoon coming in, and he read it once, quickly, in the way he read things he wasn't sure yet what they were. Then he read it again. Then he read it a third time, slowly with his elbows on the desk. She wrote clearly, which he had expected, and without self-pity, which he had not expected to notice, but did. She told him about November 1st, 1981, the day she had spent watching his aunt and uncle's house in her animagus form, the full day of it, what she had seen and what she had concluded. She told him what she had said to Dumbledore when he arrived. You can't really want to leave him with these people. She told him about the letter left on the doorstep for Petunia. She told him that she had raised her objection once, and then she had walked away from it, and that raising an objection you did not follow through on was not the same as acting on it, and that she had had 10 years to understand this, and had not found a way to make it mean less than it meant. She was sorry she had not done more. She said this plainly, as she said everything else, and then the letter ended. She did not ask for anything from him. There was no question at the bottom, no request for a reply, no indication that she expected him to respond in any particular way. The letter simply stopped, as if she had said what she came to say, and that was sufficient. He sat there for a while. He did not write back, because he did not know what he would say, did not have, yet, the language for what reading it had done to him, the particular small internal movement of something that had always assumed he was not the sort of person people went out of their way for. The assumption had been so settled and so long-standing that it had stopped being an assumption and had become a fact he knew about himself, the way he knew that his glasses needed tape and that his hair wouldn't lie flat. He held the letter for a long time without moving. Then he folded it carefully, once, and put it in the inside pocket of his jeans. He did not throw it away. In London, Amelia Bones read the July assessment report at her desk on a Tuesday morning. It was 4 pages, written in the careful professional language of someone who documented what they observed and did not editorialize, and it noted the removal of the window bars, the removal of the cat flap, the absence of acute welfare violations, the evidence of sufficient nutrition, and the ongoing tension in the household, which was noted as a continued monitoring concern, and nothing more at this stage. She read it once. She set it down. She made a notation in the file. Her brother Edgar's family had never had a file like this. No one had sent a quarterly report. No one had knocked on Edgar's door in muggle clothes with a clipboard. She did not compare these things in any useful direction. They were not comparable. The situations were entirely different, and the fact that Edgar was dead and Harry Potter was 12 years old and eating meals at his kitchen table was not a moral calculus that resolved neatly. She kept the file. She locked it in her cabinet. She went back to work. At the end of August, Pomfrey stood alone in the hospital wing. The beds were fresh. The medical stores were inventoried and replenished and checked against the new academic year's anticipated needs. The ward was quiet with the particular quality of a room that was about to be needed and wasn't yet. She liked this time of year, had always liked it, the brief pause between what had happened and what was coming. She thought about the record she had written in June 1992. It had not been a dramatic act. She had sat at this desk in the small hours with an 11-year-old boy in the nearest bed, and she had written down what she had found, and she had addressed it to the right desk, and she had sent it. She was a healer. That was what healers did. They documented what they observed, and they sent it to the people with the authority to act on it, and they did not stop treating the patient while the machinery processed. The record stood. It had always stood. She had simply, this once, ensured it was read. She did the last of the year's paperwork. She put on the kettle. The Hogwarts Express left King's Cross at 11 o'clock on the morning of September 1st, 1993, exactly as it always had. Harry Potter was 13 years old. He had a trunk, an owl, a set of new school books, and in the inside pocket of his jacket, folded once, a letter from Professor McGonagall that he had not thrown away. He sat by the window. Ron was beside him, already talking about the new term, already constructing elaborate theories about what third year would require of them, and whether Wood had finally sorted out the beta problem. Hermione had a new timetable, and was explaining why it was technically possible to take more subjects than there were hours in the day. and Harry was listening to both of them with the comfortable half-attention of someone who knew these people very well. He looked out the window. The countryside was moving past in the September morning light, the city falling away into hills and fields, and the long particular green of England going north. And he thought about the letter in his pocket, and the woman with the clipboard and the bars that weren't on his window anymore. And he didn't know yet what to do with any of it, or how to feel about it, or whether it required feeling anything in particular. He was 13. He was on the train. He was going back to school. But he knew. And this was new. There were people who had seen what summer was and had not looked away from it. He sat with that on the train going north. It was small